that you're telling that like one hostess she should really believe in herself or whatever. So it's really cute, these really cute moments. But then you also have like Mr. Libido
dancing in his underwear.
Yeah, yeah. You got a chance to play Borderlands 3 last week, and it sparked a discussion, at least between the two of us, about comedy writing in games specifically, and why oftentimes games get it right so rarely. You know, like it sucks to like have that, you know, thought in the back of your head, but it's true. Like there are only like a handful of games I could think of, at least in terms of writing, that get comedy so right. So I was wondering if you had any like examples of games that you think kind of nail it when it comes to the comedy side of things.
Yeah, it's super rare, right? A lot of the games that like I think of tend to be older, right? Like a lot of the old like LucasArts adventure games, right? Or a few that like make general stabs in that direction. Like more like less funny games and more funny moments. And like when I say funny moments, I just go like, hey.
Yeah.
During like an Uncharted game or something like that, you know?
Right. I always kind of break games, at least in terms of comedic writing, into 3 different categories. There's like the self-aware game, like Portal or Stanley Parable or something like that, where it's like, it's very clearly aware that it's a weird experience, that you're interacting with this world and you have to, you know, suspend your disbelief. So it pokes fun at that every once in a while. But yeah, you're right. It's always like these kind of chuckle moments, but never anything that like really stays with you and kind of like, I don't know, maybe even influences your own sense of humor or like your own, I don't know, style or what you're drawn to. But I think the interesting thing is we had Stephen wrote an article recently about politics in games, and I know, don't worry, we're not going to get into that. But one of the things that stuck with me was the idea from I think one of the Ubisoft developers about how gameplay is always first. And I think that's one of the challenges, I want to say, with comedy in games is like you have a mechanic and you sort of write around that mechanic, because there are games that are like visually funny, like slapsticky games. Like, I mean, I think about like Gang Beasts or Overcooked or things like that, where like it's funny to watch the thing play out. And then there are the obvious ones like Goat Simulator or, you know, Octodad, that are like just very funny to watch play out, knowing the sort of, you know, dramatic irony happening there. It's very rare that we get them injected into the sort of DNA of a game from its creation. And I think a lot of it also has to do with like just the way games are created. Like writing always kind of comes after this sort of interactive thing is established. So it's like, I'm curious like how developers or writers in the future can, I mean, and we see a little bit of it now in like the indie space, right? Like we definitely see more of it.
With indie games, you see it more, right? Like you were talking about, like, you know, all these like Gang Beasts and all these, well, Gang Beasts doesn't really count. It's you know, mechanical, right? It's funny to watch.
Right.
But like Stanley Parable, you were saying, where these games are made by like a handful of people. Part of what they want to do is tell a story, and if that story is funny, then it's funny, you know? When you have like big game development, right? Writing comes later in the process, or just, you know, wherever it comes in the process, games take such a long time to make, right? There's an immediacy that you need for comedy to work, right? And game development's not very conducive to it, which is why I think we see the funniest things in video games tend to come from just people playing them. Like one of my favorite things now are just like people doing joke levels in Mario Maker. And like part of that is also like the delivery, right? Like you see it in the tweet, and the tweet says, oh, I made a, you know, like an impossible choice, you know, simulator or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, it's part of just the thing where it's like movies, where we compare games to movies, and that doesn't really work because they're not one-to-one.
Right.
We have to sort of like think of comedy differently in video games, because it just naturally doesn't work for the same kinds of humor.
It's usually on the player side of things where things naturally bubble up, and, you know, now with things like YouTube and Twitter and, you know, even our very own like highlight reel, shameless plug, you see like these really fun things happen, sometimes even by accident. I think of even like the best parts of The Sims, where you find these weird challenges that the community make up, or things that just happen by just conveying your story to someone else. But it's very rarely a thing you experience like a movie, like you said, because it's so, they're not one-to-one. And Uncharted and those kind of games rely so heavily on, I think, the performance, like really nailing the joke or the little subtle kind of human moment, but it's never something where you're like laughing out loud, like uproariously at the screen. It's always just kind of these like, huh, that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Like, it's never something that like you'll really remember, because I can't even really remember. I mean, where like, Yakuza has this like these really funny, slapsticky moments at times, but other times it balances the absurd sort of dichotomy of like, all right, we're this like super tough gangster or ex-gangster, and we're gonna like beat up these bad dudes, and then it's like you're telling that like one hostess she should really believe in herself or whatever. So it's really cute, these really cute moments. But then you also have like Mr. Libido
dancing in his underwear.
Yeah, yeah. So
just because.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times too, some of that comedy, especially like in games from Japan, they really come through, because I think they're, for the most part, just willing to get wacky and not hold their subject matter to be like too serious or whatever. I think that can be a strength sometimes when you lean into it, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, like a big part of comedy is just incongruity, right? Like things, like realizing that things in this situation don't really belong in this situation, that, and that's part of what we find funny, like words that aren't used in normal contexts, or like people in places where they don't belong. Because so much of video games takes place in the player's head, right? It's a player thinking a lot about a bunch of systems in a machine, right? There's a lot of information there back and forth that an observer can't see, right? So like if I play a game like Octodad, right? Like the joke of that game is that you have to work so hard to control all his limbs and stuff like that. So you're doing all this weird crap with the controller, and it's just hard to do the simplest thing. That's funny to you because you're playing it, but like if someone's streaming it, or you don't know how the video game works, maybe it's frustrating. Maybe it's not as funny. For an American audience, where it's just sort of like, a game from another country with a different culture, does seem incongruous, where it's just sort of like, oh, wait, that's right, I'm not centered in this thing. I'm ignorant. Ha, that's funny.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, it's weird because we think of comedy as a thing that can be shared by a lot of people, right? And a lot of times games is very personal and like intimate. So it's strange. Like it functions on mostly a different level.
Seeing gameplay of games like Borderlands 3, especially in the pipeline, it makes me want just a little more from those kind of games, and it's hopefully they'll deliver that. We still haven't played the final build for sure, but a lot of times that humor doesn't land for me in particular, and I could see why it resonates with a lot of people for sure. But for me, I always find myself wanting just a little more, and I'm always waiting for that little like indie or whatever to come out and take risks that I think maybe even some of the bigger companies are a little more hesitant to make. And I think, like you said a second ago too, I think with indie games a lot of times they come from such a personal place because they come from such small teams, or like you see games come out that are made by like 2 people. So there's a lot more freedom and flexibility there to actually say something more direct and not have it be so filtered, I guess, through different teams or having too many cooks, I guess.
I do want to see games try to be like uproariously funny. Like I want to see people try and make me laugh for like 90 minutes straight. When you talk about like a big game like Borderlands or something, or just like any big sort of like shooter or Destiny or an action game like Assassin's Creed or something like that, they talk about like wanting to make sure there's plenty of content for every kind of player, right? So like if you like stealth, they got these missions. If you like straight up action, they got these missions. If you like a little bit of role playing, you can do some of that too, right? Comedy's subjective, so like there's lots of different kinds of comedy. And that's like hard to do, right? Because like you have comedians whose entire career like go in one lane pretty much, right? So it's hard to specialize in that many different kinds of comedy, or make sure there's something that everyone finds funny, because you just can't know, right? You just have to like sort of pick a lane and hope it works for a lot of people. And that's like antithetical to like how a lot of big games are made. So it's hard. I would love to see, like a game try, or at least, commit more to like making comedy the point, or like a very big point, like one of the big pillars. That's the fun, like game design word. I sympathize with that struggle because, sometimes I'll work harder to make like a funny tweet than I do to write like a whole long, freaking thing.
Yeah.
Just because like, comedy's hard, man.
even in film, it doesn't get in my opinion, I think a lot of people share the same perspective that it doesn't get a lot of the respect it really deserves. Even like, say what you will about the award shows, but yeah, sometimes you're like, that comedy movie tried a lot harder than some of these, dramatic moments. But yeah.
Game Night, Best Picture last year.
God, get out of here! You're fired.